Last episode, we started at or near the top of the Adriatic, and just ignore the fact that we are technically backpedaling in a northerly direction this week. But since we had to devote the front half of the episode to summarising the history of the Venetian Republic, we did jump into Istria a little cold. Now, we'll keep it brief, but I think we need to give a bit of historical context for the Venetians here, as well as Istria in general. Istria is a very natural jumping off point for Venice. Looking at a map, you can see the axis of the Adriatic trade is primarily north to south, so unless for whatever reason you are hugging the shores of the Italian coast, any thoroughfare in and out of Venice is going to pass the Istrian Peninsula. There's a puzzle piece that we haven't properly examined yet, though there's also an absolute Jenga tower of names, cultures and happenings from post-476 AD that we are very much at risk of collapsing in an attempt to pull out this single brick. But in brief, after Italy was largely lost to the Romans, the Eastern Empire under Justinian, with Belisarius at its head, reconquered it, then lost it, then reconquered it again, only for Italy to eventually be lost again to the Lombards. So by the 570s, the Lombards ended up in control of Milan and the lion's share of northern and also central southern Italy, a span of land around Ravenna, and then forming a loop around the top of the Adriatic, which included the lagoon communities that would eventually coalesce into Venice, also looped round further to incorporate Istria. So this holdout of Roman authority that in 580 was organised under the rule of an exarch to become the Exarchate of Ravenna. Technically, this would also be the authority for the other Roman holdings on the Italian boot, but Jenga Tower, not doing this now. It means that for a little shy of 2 centuries, Venice and the cities of Istria were on a common trajectory, as distinct from what was happening in the surrounding area. And this is still in evidence in a lot of architecture. I mean, put a pin in it, particularly for when we start discussing Poreč. It's one reason why, as regards Istria, we soon start running into the problem of separating the Venetian rulers from the native. We already spoke about this in the series. It's not that the residents of the city of Venice came over and replaced the population of Istria. Like elsewhere, the Venetians would comprise a ruling elite. However, unlike a lot of other places we're heading, where you can put some reasonably firm dates on the era of Venetian rule, like as distinct from other powers or ruling authorities that might have controlled parts of, for example, Greece or Cyprus, etc., Venetian control over Istria was pretty long-standing, and there's not really one firm start point. It comes to a point where it's hard, maybe even impossible, to disentangle where Venetian Istria starts and native Istria ends. And that's just the timeline. If you want to pull out a map and determine where Venetian control of Istria started and stopped, that's also a little fuzzy. As Venetian power increased through the 10 and 1100s, they certainly cast a long shadow over the coastal cities of Istria, having wrestled control of Pula, Rovinj, Poreč and Koper by the end of the 1200s, though not without quite a bit of conflict between the above. The coast was pretty much an exclusive Venetian domain. But further inland, the town of Pazin, for example, remained out of reach, eventually becoming a holding of the Habsburgs. But before this intro eats up half the runtime again, let's wrap this up. But final note, one of the most visible contributions Istria made to the Republic was as a source of Istrian stone. Venice has no major source of stone in its immediate area, and the type of Istrian limestone, with its rather pleasing off-white, was used in everything from the Rialto Bridge to the Ducal Palace and many more beside. I mean, it seems like half the city of Venice is hewn out of the stuff. So, zooming in on the specific towns. Now, last episode we saw Pula and Vodjan, and I opened by suggesting that Pula was the most important city in the area, and okay, much as that may be true in modern times, being the largest and having an international airport serving it, in antiquity, Pula's significance would continue to diminish with each destruction event before the Austro-Hungarians made it into a major naval hub in the 1800s. But just to the north, Rovinj remained a vibrant town with a significant population. You can see from above how Rovinj used to be a round island, just separated from the land. You can see a lot of these water droplet-like isles that are scattered around the Istrian coast. And tightly packed buildings marked the abrupt end of the town at the water's edge. The channel itself was filled in around 1763, so is much more modern, and there was just time for this, the Khalifi Palace, to be built there before the Venetian Republic ceased existing, and it still retains this rather large lion, and just opposite that is Balbi's Arch, dating to 1680, with an equally impressive lion. Just behind that, you have the Communal Palace, the town's council building with the city coat of arms from the 1700s, as well as mayor's crests from the 15 and 1600s. Though, sadly, all of this is in lieu of the former city walls and the bridge that used to span the small channel, all of which were destroyed when the city expanded and the channel was filled. On the whole, the rest of the town is very tightly packed, and there aren't as many buildings that you can get an identifiable date. But Rovinj is more of a vibe. It's definitely a great place to get lost, and the streets are exceptionally beautiful if you do. Of course, the exception to this anonymity is the church at the very top of the town. I lamented in the travel episode that we missed the window to actually walk up the bell tower by just a few minutes, much as this would have given us a far better top-down view of the town. The Church of St. Euphemia, whichever, that you can now see is pretty young. It was constructed between 1725 and 1736, but this was a rebuilding on a site that had churches from much further back. You can see some reliefs that have been used from these earlier structures. Even the bell tower is younger, constructed between 1654 and 1680, though this also saw reworking in the 1700s. I start to glaze over in Baroque churches, and bothering with the various apocryphal stories of the sarcophagus being washed to shore containing the remains of St. Euphemia are, well, much as they sound, about as plausible as an episode of Paw Patrol. I mean, even the notion a sarcophagus the size of a small car and about 3 times the weight could casually wash ashore like a used drinking straw. And not unlike many saints, there's another church arguing they have the real body. But just before we move on, while it's outside of our area of interest for this episode specifically, this is the heptagonal chapel of St. Trinity. Yeah, it's not often you see a 7-sided church, and a 7-sided church from the 1100s no less. It's right by the bus station, and I got off the bus and saw this tiny, ancient-looking thing, but there was no info on it there. Apparently, this is the oldest building remaining in Rovinj, so that's kind of cool. However, compared to what's on show in the next city, only about 10 miles to the north, another promontory on the Istrian coast is occupied by Poreč. Now, while it doesn't contain a Pula-sized amphitheatre, yeah, it's annoying how Pula gets to win every round of top trumps with that particular card, Poreč boasts far, far more from antiquity than Rovinj. Even just its street layout is an accurate callback to the Roman town that was sited there. And while the remains of the Temple of Neptune near its tip are a little worse for wear compared to... Pula, stop having all the good Roman stuff. Look, here's the Euphrasian Basilica. 500s, gorgeous mosaics. How'd you like that? You can see the commonality between the golden mosaics that have survived here and the contemporary mosaics in Ravenna on the opposite side of the Adriatic. So that rightly occupied a lot of my trip, but there's a lot more besides in the town. To the northeastern corner of the old town, the walls are a multi-period patchwork, fortified in antiquity but repeatedly rebuilt and reinforced between the 11 to 1500s. This tower, which has inexplicably lost many of its facing stones, is dated to 1447, and you can see a familiar Venetian cordon running horizontally. However, there are other towers that have survived much better along this stretch. While not as obvious as the buildings that have encroached around the former line of the walls, just a few yards south of here is the pentagonal tower, an irregular, angular tower that has a cafe on top. And opposite this, in turn, is the round tower, or rotunda, from 1474, also with a cafe on top. It's strange that these weren't part of the same building program. To be honest, I have no idea if these two businesses are beefing. Without prior knowledge of either, I chose to have an espresso and a beer at the top of the rotunda, from which this huge rectangular sign on the pentagonal opposite, I don't know, I just can't help but feel it's a little passive-aggressive. Still, I am here for the archetypal Venetian artillery fortifications with a nice familiar cordon. But the town still boasts a lot more buildings from its Venetian period. I breezed over the Euphrasian Basilica as a Byzantine Exarchate era, and while it parallels the contemporary churches in Ravenna, it of course has later stages and owes quite a bit of the sympathetic work from the end of the 1200s when the town had become aligned with Venice. Just a little later, the Church of St. Francesco was also built in the 1200s, with its tower being quite a bit later from the 1700s. Unfortunately, a bit tricky to get a wide view as it's so hemmed in by other buildings. As you walk through the town, there's a great many telltale windows in both Venetian Gothic and Romanesque styles. Zipping through these, the Romanesque house that stands alone in the centre of town is a close call, being originally from some time in the 1200s, but it's an impressive survivor and nonetheless has clearly been upkept over the centuries. Nowadays it's a gallery. Just opposite is a grand building decked out with impressive Venetian Gothic windows, and it's one of several along this street, including next to that, the Zuccato Palace, a grand 3-storey Gothic renovation of a former Romanesque house in around the 1400s. And this, next door, which is similarly impressive, though I've not been able to identify it. To the south, on a parallel street, as well as other Venetian Gothic buildings, there's the House of the Two Saints, built in the 1300s. Again, sorry I can't back up and get a wider shot at these, but they are tightly hemmed in as can be. On your way out, the Loggia might look reminiscent of the others we've seen, but it's noticeably much newer, built in 1910. So yes, Poreč, that's a pretty special place on all counts. In fact, it's a tough act to follow, and sure enough, while you can keep going up the Istrian coast and find more former Venetian towns that look pretty similar to Rovinj and Poreč in layout and aesthetic, lovely though these may be, there are distinctly diminishing returns on architecture of interest, and with limited time available to us and limited distinctive structures to check out, Novigrad, Umag and Izola didn't make the list. Sorry guys. But at this point we found our way all the way up the coast into what is now Slovenia. And actually a bit chuffed. I'd thought for a long time this would be another we couldn't get to, but we made it a priority, and after a modestly lengthy bus journey as part of a big digression, which is a story for another time, here is Koper. And yes, pronunciation seems to land somewhere between Koper and Koper, but given that I am English, we'll go with Koper as in, "Gore blimey, it's the Koppers, I've been rumbled, cheese it." Yes. And considering I was here for basically just an afternoon, I had forgotten just how many Venetian-era structures there are here. It's pretty bonkers, so I'm going to have to make this a bit of a speed run. I'm embarrassed to say that all of my wide shots of the town rather undersell it. From the Campanile, you do get incredible top-down views, but between the modern industrial clutter of the dock to the north and the landscape to the south, the city doesn't have quite the same historical outline as, say, Rovinj, but you can definitely see the commonality in the layout. And no prizes for guessing, just like the others, this was functionally an island until modern land reclamation filled in the gaps around the town. I mean, this postcard is from 1914, and you can still see the sizable gap between mainland and island. Yeah, a bit of a brief background on the city. While there had been a Roman settlement here, the city became an island refuge from attacks on the mainland, in much the same way as Dubrovnik, Zadar, or of course Venice. Putting water between you and the various attackers in northern Italy was the way to go. And the city particularly received an influx of citizens from Trieste in fleeing the Lombards in 1568. So Koper remained a relative safe haven for a while, but power in the region would remain in constant flux with the collapse of Frankish control, regional conflicts, and later even Saracen raids. While Koper was in a comparatively strong position in the region, as far back as 932, Koper was supplying Venice with 100 amphoras of wine in exchange for protection. Yet, when tensions arose between Venice and the Holy Roman Empire, Koper sided with the HRE and was awarded city rights in 1035. It was only at the end of the 1200s that Venice finally had control of the city, even after a prolonged period of Koper and other cities nearby trying to retain their independence through alliances. A lot has survived from the next 500 years of Venetian rule. Wandering into town to see what I could find, ended up at the Brolo Square with all of these beautiful historic wellheads, and if you look to the right and okay, this building, the Fontico, seems to not be content unless it's exhibiting all the Venetian architectural conventions at once. Apparently this was a grain warehouse built between the 1300s to being finished by at least 1460. What it fails to mention is why they went to this degree of trouble to decorate a warehouse so elaborately. I can't say for sure, but I feel like this is later work. Just down the side of that is the rather small church of St. Jacob, built in the early half of the 1500s, and opposite is the Gravisi Barbabianca Palace, built around 1710. The focal point of the city, with its standout structures, and it's ever so pretty, is what is now known as Tito Square, with a loggia, a church, an impressive campanile, and best of all, the Praetorian Palace. We started out by climbing the campanile, which may have been built as early as the 1100s, but apparently we're not confident on the evidence for that. It was rebuilt beginning in 1418 and with some additions in 1664. And not forgetting the cathedral, again, potential original build in the 1100s. Sadly, you can see a large portion of the cathedral has been plastered over rather unsympathetically. This beautiful facade is a redesign from 1488. The Praetorian Palace quite rightly steals the show. It's the main town hall with an instantly recognisable outline. It actually began life as two separate palaces from around the 1200s. The work visible now is a Venetian rebuild from around the mid-1400s, with a facade being updated in 1664. The new loggia opposite was remodelled in the 1600s, but was originally built in 1554 to commemorate an outbreak of plague. I did take the time to duck into the side streets and see a bit more of the city. Believe it or not, I am actually skipping over some of the Venetian-era buildings I passed, as this episode is rapidly devolving into a bit of a two-dimensional list of 500-ish-year-old buildings. Heading in a rough anti-clockwise loop, you get to the Belgromoni Taco Palace, probably most famous as the city's museum, that was originally built around 1600. Then heading to the western extent of the town by the waterfront, you get to this rather interesting open structure in the square. This was originally built as a salt warehouse in the 1600s. Before the area between the shore and the main town of Koper was reclaimed as solid ground, it was used to house large salt pans, and the city was a major source of salt for Istria and beyond. Opposite that is the Carpaccio house from the 1300s. As you can see, losing the light a bit, but the Pont Fountain is a rather elaborate centrepiece to this open square, dated to around 1666, and you can see the remains of Koper's walls. This is the Muda Gate. Muda means toll, and while it's built from the much older fortifying wall of the town, the Muda Gate is a Venetian build from around 1516. So yes, it's a lot. Credit to the city, they have signs on almost every historic building with a date, so it's possible to identify the Venetian-era buildings much more readily than you might elsewhere. If you travel further north of Koper, in fact barely half an hour bus ride, a rare but significant hole in the area of Venetian control, it's the city of Trieste. It was perhaps inevitable that with such a high level of Venetian control along the Adriatic all the way down to Albania, the other inland powers, like for instance Hungary, would be looking for somewhere to punch through to allow them coastal access. That's not for lack of trying from Venice to occupy Trieste, which they did at least 3 times, but never for more than 4 years before the status quo was re-established. I will say, it was a real abrupt change in environment. Having spent days in the tight streets of the former Venetian towns in Istria, to suddenly find yourself in all of the broad Baroque boulevards, barely dipping lower than 6 to 7 stories high, it was quite a shock to the system. It certainly has a very different feel to the other cities just a short way down the coast. But yes, as it's not part of the Venetian sphere, we're not going to stick around for this episode, so pardon us if we take a rather large jump. Truthfully, when I look at what is there, I feel a pang of shame that I didn't get a bit further into the Istrian interior. I had made plans and contingency plans on getting on one of the tiny trains to Rock and Hum and some others, but the very short supply of trains turned into a devil of a travelling salesman problem, which was just too much to attempt on my final day when I still needed to ensure I made it to the airport. You know, it's just not the time to strand yourself miles inland with no transport links. Bottom line, without a hire car, the small towns of Istria are a difficult proposition. I praised the bus system in the Pula travel episode, but it doesn't link everywhere. For instance, the beautiful square of Svetvinčanat, short of a hire car or a considerable taxi ride, it's just not happening. We saw the ruins of Divigrad. Took about half a day by the time I'd got the train out there and then walked something like 90 minutes to a 2-hour loop from Kanfanar. I have a feeling that even after this series, where we sweep all the way down the Adriatic through Croatia, Montenegro and Albania and down to Greece, around the Aegean before heading back to the north of Italy, we'll probably end up with some fill-in junk drawer type episodes where we plug all the assorted holes left by the limited time we had the first time around. And it is always a limited time. Just let's be clear. We have to do these trips on a shoestring budget on a handful of days, which means cramming in as many sites as we can fit between the rising and the setting of the sun. If the sun is rising at 6, well, that's probably when we get started. I don't know who this extended plea for absolution is for exactly. I don't know any UK residents who could haul me up on not fitting in the twin gates of Motavan on our itinerary. But I suppose I just bristle at the implication we're not trying or being sloppy. Anyway, all of that said, we have one more stop before passing south out of Istria. Heading to the other side of the V with Pula near its point, you pass through a more mountainous landscape and arrive at Labin. You can see it from above here. The modern town doesn't look especially noteworthy, but the old town is perched high up on this plateau, and that's where we're headed. Apart from being an ancient hill fort and then the Roman settlement of Albona, Labin in the Middle Ages passed into Venetian control in 1420. On the way up, the walls are somewhat hidden behind the trees, but if you get up close, you can just see the distinctive shape and even this, which we'll get to later. As you round the corner, and trying to avoid getting hit by all the traffic that has to funnel up this road, and you can't miss the extremely distinctive Venetian round corner tower built here in 1604, and that just put the biggest smile on my face. You find yourself in a surprisingly busy square with, all of that traffic struggling to get past in both directions. For a town this size, I mean, my goodness is it keen to point out local points of interest. Okay, quick highlights. The entrance to the town is the Venetian Gate of San Fior, built sometime between the 14 to 1500s, as well as the Venetian line up top. The coat of arms is that of Labin, and the one on the left, the Grimani family. Just inside the gate, there's the Church and the Nativity of Mary. Oh, well, that's a bit more manageable. Built in 1336 over a smaller structure from the 1000s, but various rebuilds followed, including a major restoration in 1993. The Battiala Lazzarini Palace is from 1630 with a facade from 1727. It houses the town museum, but it was closed. So, okay. At the far end of the town, you get this small fortification, which is now mostly a car park, but it affords unbelievable views both to the coast and to the interior. Then, just a short distance away, actually it's redundant saying that, Labin is only a few hundred metres across, everything is a short distance away, but this is the Church of St Justus and the Campanile. Irritatingly, I'd seen a dating for this to the 1800s, but now I can't find where that was. So with some uncertainty, the date I'm finding attached to it seems to be about 1623, clearly with some concrete added to it later, and I joked in the Pula episode about just how sketchy these steps look. There's almost something endearing about having a tower this unsafe looking, but somehow still open for visitors to climb. Almost endearing. Well, okay, that's about all we've got for Istria for now, and with the hope that in future we may be able to come back and add more to the list. But that means it's time for Lion Watch, and Koper has more lions than a honey-glazed antelope carcass in the savannah. And some of them get truly ridiculous, such as these on the Gravisi Barbianca building. There may be more to this, like some sort of sculptural joke that I'm not quite getting. Sorry for the zoom, but that's definitely supposed to be a lion. I don't know what's happened with this one. It rather resembles Goofy after a heavy bender. Proceeding to Tito Square, there's a couple higher up on the Praetorian Palace. This one appears to be a warthog cosplaying as a lion. Even with this Isaac Newton lookalike, he's just like, ugh, look at this guy. And then this one, rather dopey looking with its tongue sticking out. Both are engaged less with holding open the book that says Pax and more pouncing on it like a kitten. In that regard, I guess they are at least closer to cat behaviour. I've actually lost where in the square this was. A lion looking thoroughly repulsed by the book it is attempting to hold, like, ugh, the book, gross. Then in the garden of the Belgramoni Taco Palace, aka the museum, goodness knows what's happened here. I mean, sure, it's been weathered, but just very off-putting. And the couple more examples around the museum aren't much more promising, including this and this highly incredulous lion. Then further on, at the side of the Gavado Palace, is a somewhat better representation of the body. I mean, the musculature is quite impressive, but not as impressive as that lovely salon hairstyle. I mean, slay, queen. And finally, in the square, just opposite an entry that would be a promising primary age drawing, very professional Renaissance sculpture, not so much. And after all that, found 3 in Labin. This one above the gate is kind of inexplicable. I'm going to go with an orc with a neck beard. Above the facade of the Church of the Nativity, this one is actually not the worst attempt at the face, but the neck makes it look proportionally ridiculous. Finally, an easy one to miss, embedded in the outer walls and partly masked by trees, Inexplicably, the most broken looking, whilst also the least weathered. I'm not sure if that's the result of a restoration job. Closest I can think of, it's a bit like a Japanese kabuki mask. I feel like the obvious criticism here is, well, it's not like you could do any better. And no, of course not. I would do infinitely worse than these. But being a sculptor or a mason, that was an actual profession. And the fact that so many of these really weirdly poor examples survive, and please understand, I'm not like hiding a bunch of good ones just to say like, oh, look at all the rubbish ones. The only time you ever catch a good Venetian lion sculpture is when it's been done really recently or like heavily restored. And that's just what makes this segment so crazy. Like, how did they never get this right? How did not one of these guys manage to successfully carve a reasonable lion in this whole time? Anyway, more of that next week. The music you've been hearing in the background is ours. We create all the music for these episodes, and you can find it on bandcamp.com. If you want to support the channel, that is the place to do it, but please do also find us on the various socials. You can follow us there. And of course, you'd be massively helping us if you'd subscribe and leave a comment below this. Otherwise, we'll catch you on the next one.